Hello, bonjour. Welcome to the Union Safety Net, le filet de sécurité syndicale, a union podcast for working people. I'm your host, Sébastien Bezeau, et oui, parfois en français aussi. This podcast is hosted by the Union of Safety and Justice Employees, le syndicat des employés de la sécurité et de la justice. Join us for an informative discussion every month about issues currently affecting working people. In this episode, we get to pick renowned economist Jim Stanford's brain about the state of the Canadian economy, what can be learned from other countries, and how unions fit in nationally and internationally. Switching to a local community lens, we then chat with Antonio Trujillo Villon of Turning Leaf Support Services, a Winnipeg-based organization that provides support to people living with mental illness and intellectual challenges, about how unions can help foster change at home. Jim Stanford, thank you for being here.
It's a great pleasure, Seb. Thanks for having me.
So for our listeners, Jim, you really are a rock star in the labor movement. It's an honor to have you on our show, truly. And I mean, just by way of a short introduction, you currently serve as economist and director of the Center for Future Work. The center is independent and nonpartisan and operates in Canada in collaboration with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. You divide your time between Sydney, Australia and Vancouver, Canada. And prior to that, you served for over 20 years as economist and director of policy with Unifor, Canada's largest private sector trade union, which was formerly known as the Canadian Auto Workers, and that's when I first became a union member and found out about you. And you've also written a number of books, including the very popular Economics for Everyone, a short guide to the economics of capitalism, which has been published in 6 languages. I feel we could talk about any aspect of the economy and labor market with you and get very exciting answers. But we need to be reasonable and concentrate on just a few. So let's get into it. So Jim, you testified at a Senate committee last October on how to best design policy about Canada's temporary and migrant labor force. You made a few surprising statements during your testimony, and I would like to explore those. So number 1, tell me, is Canada experiencing a labor shortage?
No, absolutely not. I've always been deeply skeptical of the complaints that you hear from employers that there's a shortage of workers in Canada. That's a very self-serving line of argument. I think employers got used to a situation where there was so much unemployment in Canada and so many desperate workers seeking work that they could just put up a job ad and get, 10 or 15 or 20 fully qualified people in their inbox the next day. That wasn't a sustainable situation. And now that we've got a better balance between the number of workers and the number of jobs, it's still not perfect. But employers complain that it's harder to find workers, that they don't have the right attitude, that they quit and go to better jobs, or they demand better wages. That's what it's really about. It isn't that we've run out of workers at all. We've still got 1.3 million unemployed Canadians at last count, and hundreds of thousands of others who aren't working to their full capacity. So we have to be very suspicious of these complaints from the employer side about running out of workers. We just haven't done that.
What about Canada's demographics? We keep hearing that our demographics are creating acute labor shortages, but some, including you, have said that this is not substantiated by facts. What is the role of older workers in the current labor market?
Yeah, I think that this assumption that there's an aging baby boom bubble, and once the baby boomers start retiring, that's when the labor shortage will get really severe. I think that argument, that narrative has underpinned a lot of the labor shortage hypothesis that we've heard. And I mean, obviously, there is a demographic transition happening in Canada. Older people who were born in that baby boom era are reaching retirement age. But lots of other things have been happening at the same time. Number one, those older workers themselves are staying in the labor market longer. Sometimes that's by choice. If you've got a job you really enjoy, then you might not want to retire at 60 or 65. You might want to keep working, at least on a part-time basis. Secondly, we've seen improvements in labor force participation in other parts of our population, particularly, of course, among women. That's a long-term trend that women who always worked, of course, but often at home without pay. But now most women of working age are in the formal labor market, working for pay, in addition to the unpaid work they're still doing at home, unfortunately. But it does mean that the labor supply has been boosted by that. We've also seen a very interesting thing the last couple of years, Seb, since the COVID pandemic. We've actually seen the labor force getting younger on average, not older, quite opposite to the assumptions. And the reason for that is the big surge in immigration to Canada that's happened since the COVID pandemic. There's good aspects to that surge and bad aspects, particularly employers who are using this temporary foreign worker program to hire people at low wages in very insecure jobs. We've also seen, I think, a lot of misuse of the international student population as a pool of very low-wage, insecure labor. But put it all together, and we've actually seen a decline in the average age of the workforce in Canada because of that increased population at the other end. Immigrant workers in general, not always, but in general tend to be younger than the rest of the population. So all told, we are not experiencing a demographic collapse in labor supply as some of those simplistic arguments once argued. And there's all kinds of implications of that, both for how we manage the labor market and job creation and so on, but also how we manage things like pensions. That scary, scary narrative that, everyone's going to be retired and no one will be left to do the work has underpinned a lot of the calls for restraint or restrictions or cutbacks in pensions and other old age benefits. And again, the economic evidence suggests it isn't going to be a crisis at all. In fact, it's change we knew was coming for decades. We can respond gradually, and our old age programs are actually in really good shape.
Well, it's very comforting here that coming from an economist such as yourself. You just mentioned yourself right now, unemployment rate in Canada translates to about 1.3 million Canadians who are currently unemployed. What's the role of employers in the current market? What are their responsibilities?
Well, ultimately, employers in our economy don't really feel they have a responsibility to workers or even to society as a whole. Their mission in life is to make money for the private sector anyways, and pay as little tax on that money as they can. So their actions are motivated by self-interest of the company itself, and this trickles into how they manage their labor input requirements and how they manage their workers. So in recent years, for example, we've seen many employers trying to take advantage of new models of employment that are more sort of hyper flexible or insecure. Things like labor hire work or temporary jobs, or the use of flexible part-time work instead of offering people full-time roles. In the extreme, the positions we see in the digital platform or so-called gig economy, where people aren't actually even treated like employees. They're just paid on a per task basis. And if there's no task, then there's no work. So this is one way in which employers, I think, have tried to shift the risks of ups and downs in business onto the backs of their workforce. And there's other ways in which they've tried to reduce their labor costs in ways that undermine the quality of work and in a way, the social stability of our labor force.
Even their two-tier pension systems, right? That we've seen in the last few years coming in. It's something brand new. Now, strike actions across Canada have been on the rise since the start of the decade. Throughout your long tenure at Uniform, you would have seen and supported many strike actions. Can you paint us a picture of the employment situation in Canada and how it helps to explain this rise in strikes in the last few years?
From a union's perspective, that uptick in labor mobilizing or labor militants, I guess you could say, is in a way a positive sign, although some of the factors behind it are negative. So I would say the biggest single factor behind the upsurge in work stoppages that we saw in the last 2 years has been the takeoff of inflation after the COVID pandemic. So we kind of got used to inflation in Canada just kind of chugging along at about 2% a year, and sort of forgot that could be a problem if it changed. And unfortunately, employers during that period of low, stable inflation, in most cases, managed to take away any of the built-in protections against inflation that many unions had negotiated in things like cost of living protections and other contract provisions. those mostly are all gone. So when inflation took off after COVID, it reached a high of about 8% in Canada in 2022. Most workers were left behind. Their wages could not keep up. So naturally, as soon as they get back to the bargaining table, unions want to make up for lost ground. So both to compensate for the impacts of previous inflation and to protect workers against inflation that's still continuing. It's slowed down a lot to around 3% now, but that's still a bit higher than historically we were used to. So unions have had to try to negotiate much stronger wage increases. On the good side, their bargaining position has been improved by the fact that unemployment has been relatively lower. Again, I stress unemployment still exists. We haven't run out of workers, and it's still a real problem for workers who cannot find stable work. But unemployment is lower than it typically was, and workers feel they have a bit more clout at the bargaining table as a result. So put those two ingredients together, and you saw both an upsurge in the number of work stoppages and also a shift in the composition of those work stoppages. Almost all work stoppages now are strikes called by the union. Very, very few of them right now are lockouts called by the employer. And that's quite different than a few years ago. As many as a third of work stoppages could have been lockouts where employers were putting people on the street to try and extract more concessions from them. In a way, is a positive sign, and it has absolutely contributed to a pickup in wage growth in Canada. So for about a year now, wages have been growing faster than prices, and this is how it should be. And we still got some damage to make up for, but Canada's, I think, labor movement has done a generally good job of trying to address the challenges of inflation and protect the interests of their members.
Now, let's talk a bit about the future of work, more specifically AI. I think that in the popular imagination, the future of work is now automatically associated with the prevalence of AI. However, the future of work is a much more complex field of possibilities than just AI. Is that your take? And is Canada in a good position when it comes to research and automation?
Well, Seb, first of all, I should know for posterity that your question was so nuanced and well written. I know you didn't get it from ChatGPT. Okay, you actually wrote that question yourself, I can tell. Well, there's a lot of hype about AI, and there's been hype about other forms of tech change in recent past. For a while there, everyone was worried that robots were going to replace all the workers and automation of different kinds. And in general, this is overstated. I mean, for sure, there are some important changes happening in technology. How those changes trickle down to the kind of plant shop floor of actual workplaces is actually a lot slower and more complicated than we typically assume. You can see on YouTube incredible things that robots can do in controlled environments, yet we actually see very, very few robots in our day-to-day lives. And in fact, my view is Canada needs more robots, not less. I'd like to see more robots taking on some of the dangerous or very boring or very low-paid jobs and let people find better work, particularly if we're managing the economy with lots of work around. So with AI, there's another whole set of issues around privacy and data confidentiality and who owns the data and what the data is going to be used and misused for by companies or by governments. So this is not to suggest this isn't an important issue. It absolutely is, and unions need to be addressing it at the bargaining table to make sure that when technological change occurs, workers have a say collectively in how that change occurs and how the costs and benefits of it are going to be shared. Our Center for Future Work actually did what I think is a really good report called Bargaining Tech, which did a survey of Canadian unions to basically catalog all the different ways that unions have tried to introduce new language into their collective agreements around technological change and all the issues related to it, whether it's consultation in designing new technology and implementing it, or notice of new tech, or job protection and severance benefits when it does affect the number of people working, provisions around privacy and not using technology as a form of sort of algorithmic management or discipline, if you like. A whole suite of measures that have to get addressed. On the whole, the fear that technology is going to eliminate our jobs is misplaced, and that has never happened, actually, in a mass way in history, even going back to the Industrial Revolution. But it does lead to major changes and disruptions in some industries and some occupations, and with any change or disruption, workers have more say when they've got collective representation and collective power. And that's why unions, I think, are all the more relevant. I know you'll find some business people who say, unions might have played a role in the Industrial Revolution or something, but now with high-tech economies, it's a knowledge economy and you don't need unions. In fact, you need a union more than ever in this knowledge economy.
Well, we have 2 minutes left. Since you do spend half of your time in Canada and Australia, I had to ask this question. What is the situation in Australia when it comes to union? On first blush, Canada and Australia appear to have a lot of similarities. Does the comparison hold on a closer inspection?
That's a great question, Seb, and one that we talk about in my family all the time. It's a never-ending compare and contrast exercise because we know both countries, and it's interesting to see where they are similar. They're large countries, resource endowed, colonial history, settler colonial history, and some commitment to sort of an egalitarian sort of social welfare model. Australia had a great thing going in the 60s and 70s. It was one of the most equal industrial countries in the world, actually comparable to Sweden. But it's gone backwards a lot since then in the face of, very right-wing government. And one of the key differences is in unions. Australia is, in essence, a right-to-work state. If people understand the labor law situation in America, you know that about half of states are so-called right-to-work states, which means unions, even when they get formed, have no right for union security or dues collection system or anything like the RAND formula that we have in Canada. And it makes it almost impossible to form and keep strong unions. And Australia's got the same thing, all under a sort of very distorted idea of individual freedom. Each individual can decide whether they want to join the union or not, even though everybody in a unionized workplace gets all of the benefits of the union. So it's a terrible kind of structural impediment to unionization, and we've seen a big decline in unionization in Australia as a result. Despite that, the unions that I work with very closely there are, tremendously progressive and creative in how they respond to that. So they're still a force to be reckoned with. But if there's a warning for Canadians from what we see in Australia, it would be make sure that we protect the right of unions to exist and be stable and be secure as a normal feature of workplaces. Otherwise, we'll see us following down the path of America and Australia in this case.
Well, I'm glad we get to keep you here in Canada for half of the year, but obviously Australia needs a lot of you as well. Jim Stanford, it's been a true honor and privilege to have you on the Union Safety Net from the bottom of our heart. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, Seb, a great honor for me too. And thank you for what you're doing to give workers a voice as we fight for a better society. Thank you.
USGE's Community Investment Initiative is one of USGE's ways of giving back by offering modest grants to support important initiatives undertaken by nonprofit organizations across the country. USGE focuses on organizations that help to strengthen public safety outcomes, whether through access to mental health services, support for grassroots community-led initiatives, or helping those in need. And who better fits these community investment initiative objectives than Turning Leaf? Here with me is Antonio Trujillo Villon, Social Enterprise Manager at Turning Leaf, a nonprofit charitable organization designed to provide crisis intervention, treatment, and support services to people living with mental illness and intellectual challenges. So, Antonio, welcome to the Union Safety Net.
Thank you so much for having me, Sebastian. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Antonio, let's talk about the mandate of Turning Leaf, because it's worth repeating here for our listeners, and I'll read it, I'll quote it. The participants of Turning Leaf's programs are often deeply impacted by their circumstances, which become barriers to living safely and independently in the community. These barriers can include homelessness, addictions, discrimination, sexual exploitation, societal stigmas, lack of access to meaningful employment and or resources, and behavior that brings them into conflict with the law. Can you tell us how the program came about?
Absolutely. In short answer, the organization itself established in 2005, so it's been quite the journey. But our CEO and founder, Barclay Engel, had experience working in this industry for quite some time, He finished his master's degree, and he is just such a large-scale thinker that in his role within this industry, he began to think larger scale and what else we could do. I think that it was the kind of thing where he had some resources and he understood what was missing from social services, specifically here in Winnipeg, because that's where we started. And from there, he branched out. And I joined in 2008 when we had 20 employees. Since then, it's become an interprovincial organization. We have over 600 employees.
Wow.
And it's been quite the journey. It's such a rewarding job. And I can't speak enough about how rewarding it's been. When we talk about the actual mandate, to talk about the barriers in general, whether it's homelessness or addiction, discrimination, these are all things that are exemplified day in and day out. At our office, we have a revolving door where participants come here to feel safe, feel supported, and get external resources. We moved buildings during the pandemic, and we have showers here, we have food hampers.
I wish people could see when you talk about, you've been there since 2008, how you went from 20 some employees to close to 600 now. Just to see it in your eyes and the physical emotion that come out of you, you can see that you're so dedicated and you take so much pride to be part of Turning Leaf. So how come you're so proud of being part of Turning Leaf? What makes you go work there every day? Why is Turning Leaf so important for the community?
It comes from the top down. As I mentioned, when I started, we had such a small office, and you can see that upper management, whether it's Barkley himself or some of our other chief officers, they always have time, not only for employees, but also for the participants that come through. It's just so inspiring, and it's the respect and the support that they give these people. It trickles down. It makes you feel something when you look across a room and you see your boss's boss doing stuff that going above and beyond. It really creates a great work environment.
You said that it's expanded quite a bit. I didn't know this. We were in Saskatchewan a few weeks ago, touring the province, meeting our members who are employed by the RCMP. And just outside of our hotel room, I was just glancing out. I'm like, there's a billboard of Turning Leaf. I'm like, well, okay, they're in Saskatchewan. They can afford a billboard. They're really well established. I was really looking forward to doing this interview with you and learning more. So the organization has grown quite a bit. You've already covered that. Now, the program is Indigenous focused, but is open to everyone in need. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So I would say that at the root of our organization is the profound desire to assist any and all individuals living with mental illness and social vulnerabilities. The population that we support is primarily Indigenous, and in the last decade, we have made a concerted effort to create and deepen the awareness of Indigenous culture and its relevance to the participants that feel that connection. In addition, our commitment to truth and reconciliation is something that continues to shape a lot of program delivery. Our Indigenous service is one of the largest expansions that we've seen in programming in the last 5 years, and we hope to keep watching it flourish for years to come. A great example of that is we have a company elder, and her name is Delvina, and she is so amazing.
I mean, elders are amazing. All elders, when you're in their presence, you just know, right?
Absolutely. And the network of people that she's brought in that have assisted not only in just creating a little bit more structure, but also just so many different avenues for participants to explore their own culture, but also just to essentially generate creative stimulation. Artwork that has been created from some of our participants in the last few years that is just mind-blowing. Some of the beadwork, for example, we have a few participants that actually are doing a little bit of social enterprising themselves now with their creation and marketing them. And we're such big fans of the strides that it's created for this organization.
Now, in 2022, USJE provided a grant of $20,000 to Turning Leaf, and this was a proposal put through by one of our members who resides in Winnipeg, and the grant was put towards a purchase of a truck. And the truck is for the purposes of new home moving service that will be added to their bedbug heat treatment approach. Can you explain more about the services that this truck is providing?
Absolutely.
Why the giggle? What's the smile?
Well, it's funny because I've kind of talked about this countless times, but I always know that it can be a little bit, it's very wordy, right? When you throw in a moving service and then you throw in this bedbug heat treatment approach. So
it's multi-use. I like it when you get the biggest bang for your buck. So you're just being smart with your resources. So kudos to you folks over there. So tell us about this magical truck.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's been a tremendous asset for social enterprise programming in the organization. We can't thank USJE enough for their support, but to kind of get into it a little bit more, the primary goal of the truck was to create a moving service for our participants who have frequently exhibited the need for advocacy when it comes to utilizing moving services. It's not uncommon that we have participants with a limited or in some cases complete absence of funds for moving services. In addition, the impact of available shifts for participants involved in our community workforce is significant. Since acquiring the truck less than a calendar year ago, we have seen a 60% increase in the amount of billable work that we can provide for participants. So it's been huge for them on that regard, and just in terms of program development. Future goals include to have the truck's cargo area professionally lined and insulated to facilitate heat treatments for items that are infested with bed bugs, providing a solution and fresh start for anyone moving out of a bed bug infested property that wants to take select items, have them heat treated, and then move forward with their life. This also allows for a new service currently unavailable to the people of Winnipeg and the surrounding areas of mobile heat treatment. In addition, the truck has allowed us to enhance some of the programming we had prior, such as mattress acquisition, food hamper distribution, and the transportation of equipment for lawn care and snow removal.
Amazing. Multi-purpose, making the most with everything that you have. That's how nonprofits strive, right? You have to be creative with the resource that you receive, and obviously you're maximizing it. Antonio, we talked briefly about the mandate of Turning Leaf, but something else that caught our attention was the guiding principles. We have to list it to our listeners. So I was interested to read that the organization emphasizes the guiding principle of 1, unconditional acceptance, and 2, empowering change in your approach to not only the lives of the individuals that you support, but the lives of each member of your team. Can you talk a bit about that?
Certainly. I think the principles that are described in that question speak to our values to create and sustain a healthy work environment. The impact within our own team is remarkable, and it's so vindicating to see the change in behavior and self-worth that our participants and staff experience. The tangible successes that my team is able to witness by providing these services and employment opportunities for participants from Turning Leaf is a consistent reminder of how far we've come, and it's equal parts enriching, inspiring, and mind-boggling to think of how much further we can go.
So if you think in 10, 20 years from now, where would you see Turning Leaf? Or would you like to see it basically disappear because there's no need for that kind of service anymore? Or how, personally, what's your vision in the next 10 to 20 years for Turning Leaf?
One, the latter suggestion to that question would be delightful. Mm-hmm. That being said, I think that at the heart of social enterprise programming was always this desire to create a temp agency from within. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but when I was in the front line before I wound up in this position, one of the things that it was tough to watch was bringing participants who were very excited to work down to temp agencies and then watching them write the aptitude test because we weren't allowed to be with them there. While we were able to provide direct support from a legal standpoint to write an aptitude test for a temp agency, you're not allowed help. So we bring them to temp agencies to go ahead and write the aptitude test or to get registered. and they'd be so excited, and quite often they wouldn't make it through their screening process. And it was always heartbreaking to see someone who wanted to change. We didn't fault the temp agencies, but we did feel like there was something more we could do. So currently, in our Rolodex of participants that we can call up to go ahead and offer work opportunities to, we have about 55, 56 participants. So I would love to go ahead and double, triple that number. I would love it if the community workforce that we have became its own entity, and we could even provide temporary or casual employment to individuals that weren't participants of Turning Leaf at some point. Because I think that there's always going to be a need there. And we'd be delighted if we were one of the organizations that got to fill it.
Well, with people like you working inside Turning Leaf and who seem so dedicated and passionate about what you do, I have no doubt in my mind that I'll just continue expanding and continue to provide crucial services to those who need it the most. Antonio, it was an honor for USJE to partner up with great people at Turning Leaf. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us and spread the word about the great work being done by this organization, everyone involved at Turning Leaf, and thank you for being part of the union safety net.
It's been our pleasure. We're again just so grateful for the support that you guys provided us, and it's going to be one of those things where we continue to see the effects and the impact of that support for years.
Merci. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Union Safety Net, Le Filet de Sécurité Syndicale, a union podcast created by USJE for working people. If you have any feedback on today's episode or would like to suggest a topic you want us to cover, please reach out on social media platforms. We love to hear from our listeners. I'm your host, Sébastien Bezeau, and I hope you'll join us next month for another episode of the Union Safety Net, Le Filet de Sécurité Syndicale.